Hi, I'm Adam, and this is Shadow Alley, my low-budget filmmaking project. I'm in the process of building a production company that specializes in low-budget, 80s-style horror. You did me! But before I do, I guess I need to explain what 80s horror is in general, and why I think it's the right path for a movie. So first, let's take a look at
what makes a great 80s-style horror movie.
The box. You opened it. We came.
Now, huge disclaimer. Analyzing your feelings about movies when you were 6 compared to when you're 36 is obviously like comparing apples to oranges. But for me, there's an absolute difference between the movies of today and the classics of the 80s.
It was a mistake!
The biggest and most obvious difference between today's films and the classics of the 80s can be found in the special effects. 80s horror directors used practical effects, meaning that all the creatures and the blood and gore were actually in front of the camera, interacting with the actors without adding them later in post with computer effects. There was a real charm in the creativity of the effects artists and a satisfaction in knowing that all the elements of the movie were actually interacting with each other, and in my opinion, that just can't be faked with computers today. I have a lot to say about computer effects versus practical effects, so make sure to watch my video on that. I'll put a link to it in the description below. 80s horror directors were somewhat limited by the practical effects and resources of that time period, which meant that they had to keep their low-budget effects in the shadows and use mood, tone, and build-up to help scare the audience. I think this is a more effective and pleasing way to scare people, rather than unearned jump scares and in-your-face digital creatures. '80s horror directors and their effects teams took pride in coming up with new and outrageous effects and tried to one-up each other in every scene. I think Alec Kerr said it best in his article in the Conway Daily Sun when he said, "The horror movies of the 1980s were a bit grungier and rough around the edges. They embraced being completely outrageous and gross for the sake of being gross. Unlike the brutality on display in modern-day torture porn films such as the Saw series, there was a macabre sense of fun." I think that's a great phrase to describe the overall horror filmmaking process in the 80s. A macabre sense of fun.
Stop the prime time, bitch!
'80s horror movies weren't one-trick ponies like today's movies. They can be enjoyed at every age, but for very different reasons. If a horror flick today fails in making you afraid, there's really no entertainment value left in the movie at all. And let's face it, many of them do fail in scaring us. This didn't seem to be an issue in the 80s. Movies had over-the-top kills that would terrify a child, but entertain an adult. Imagine a child watching a creature feature from the 80s and being completely terrified of the monsters as blood and gore hits the screen. The movie works for that child on a fear level, which may not work the same on a seasoned horror fan adult. Now imagine that adult watching the same movie from the 80s and laughing hysterically at the monster tearing the head off its victims and throwing it towards the camera. Both groups are equally affected by the movie, but in very different ways. But, make no mistake, both are entertained. Movies in the 1980s also took time to establish characters and really made you fall in love and relate to them. This made their journey through the movie that much more terrifying because we wanted to see them survive and actually cared about their safety. Let's do a small test. Think of some great movies from the 80s. You can probably name the characters, both villains and heroes, and tell a bit about them because the filmmakers did a great job fleshing them out. Now try to name the characters and a few of their traits from the last 10 horror movies that came out this year. Maybe it's a bit subjective and unfair, but I have a much harder time remembering characters nowadays. Has my viewing experience simply changed? Or do our movies today cater more towards fast-paced ADD characters more than slow-burn character development? I miss the 80s heroes and villains that had charisma and were memorable to this day. There was also a distinct separation of age groups in 80s horror, creating teams of characters that all saw and dealt with the world around them in unique and, most importantly, believable ways. Most movies had 3 distinct groups: the young kids,
Well, no amulet. Let's go.
the horny teenagers, And finally, the adults.
Thorne sends his apologies.
Oh, well, tell him I'm walking again.
The young kids were for some reason actually believable, saying lines that immature people of that time would actually say.
Major mistake.
Unlike today's dialogue that sounds like unrealistic adults writing parts for bad child actors.
Are you there? Who are you?
The horny teenagers were simply disposable characters that were punished for being sexual beings in a suppressed era. And the adults were usually little to no help whatsoever, often inhibiting the youngsters and not believing them. The groups themselves often felt more realistic and were cast because they seemed average and looked like the groups of friends, teens, and adults that you know. They looked like the people that lived in your town, went to your school, and lived on your street. Take a look at every horror film made today. If you aren't the most beautiful young woman or the most insanely fit man, there's no place for you in today's horror. It's harder for me to relate and care about characters that seem to be plucked from a Maxim magazine page rather than my hometown. I don't know any Lanes, Trevors, or Isabels. But I have a bunch of friends like Mikey, Mouth, and Chunk. These were the main differences for me, and I could probably also mention the more daring attempts at satire that existed in the 80s. Filmmakers weren't afraid of sending a message and being a bit silly and having fun. I could also dare you to sing a few songs from 80s films, or hum the background tune in a select scene, which may be an impossible task in today's horror, since all music is now only background noise, changed very little from movie to movie. Satire and memorable movie scores definitely seemed more important in the 80s. Maybe I'm looking at classic horror movies through rose-colored nostalgia glasses, and maybe I'm chasing the dragon like a drug addict, trying to feel the same way I felt in a better time. Maybe movies haven't really changed. Maybe it's just the person I am now and the way I'm watching them that's different. Or maybe, just maybe, I'm onto something here. And together, through this channel, we can analyze what made these horror movie classics and create a community and maybe eventually feature films that would make directors like John Carpenter and Wes Craven proud.